What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Jerry Dugan's X-Men run as we make our way into AXE, Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals. So here's the thing. As much as I love Jerry Dugan's run, this is the usual problem with Jerry Dugan. He's trying to cram too much stuff into a singular story. So there's a whole other side story here that has to do with Game World and is completely unnecessary for what we're talking about here. So I don't even know why it's in here, but we're going to skip over that. I mean, it is kind of the return of Mojo, which I guess is kind of cool. Mojo hasn't really been interesting since the 90s. But the thing about this is that this initially picks up with what is in effect Dr. Stasis. Now, Dr. Stasis was kind of like this looming background villain that existed over the course of the first arc, but we didn't really know what significance he was going to have. And the funny thing about this is that the way that Jerry Dugan presents Dr. Stasis, he's not that dissimilar from the High Evolutionary, in the sense that what Dr. Stasis has been doing is basically modifying animals and almost making them like anthropomorphic, right? Like animals that kind of function in the same capacity as humans to a degree, in the sense that they're basically his soldiers. And so what ends up going on is you have a being named Bornin, who basically kind of operates as like his tiger henchman, what have you. And effectively, these forces, these animals, once they consume this drink that's basically been given to them, kind of go into an almost bestial, sort of maddening state, and then are sent forward into the world in order to basically capture the genes or a being that, in a sense, Dr. Stasis is looking for. Now, we'll get this sorted out here in a second. What we end up doing here, we do get a kind of aftermath where Cyclops basically wakes up after his apparent death, and then he's basically told by Emma Frost, we really can't have you going back out there as Cyclops. And the question that we've sort of been wondering for the last little bit is why, right? What was it about the death of Cyclops that basically means that while he is resurrected, he can't really go forward and be Cyclops anymore? And the answer to that question came in the form of the attack that was launched by the forces of Dr. Stasis. That what ended up happening is, of course, the X-Men responded. Now remember, a lot of this is because this attack took place in the city of New York. The X-Men currently have the Treehouse, which is their base of operations in the city of New York. So of course, it allows them to respond to threats in New York faster than they would if they were simply just on Krakoa. And so arriving here, Cyclops unleashes holy hell. Like, he literally goes nuts on these guys and does a pretty damn good job of doing it, right? I mean, it's just manipulating the direction of his optic blast and all that kind of stuff. He just goes full on, just losing it on these guys, which is really amazing. And in fact, there's a really good point, or a really good moment that goes on here where Everett Thomas, who we'll talk about here in a second, Everett Thomas actually syncs with Cyclops and then uses his optic blast as well, which allows them to basically double down on these attacks. Now, of course, X-23 jumps in and the rest of the X-Men jump in and so on and so forth. But while all this is going on, you basically have Dr. Stasis who's monitoring the entire thing, and he basically tells Bourne and his main henchman, we're not getting what we need. I need you to respond. And that's when Bourne basically jumps in, right? Like, literally an explosion is caused, and it basically blows Cyclops kind of out of the way, and this allows the momentary distraction. Now, while this fire is going on, Sync, like Everett Thomas, actually syncs with Jean Grey. Now, this is a massive moment here, because when this happens, Sunfire realizes what's going on, and he's like, wait a minute, like, how in the world did you do that? You synced with Jean Grey, and she's not even on Earth. Like, how in the world did you manage to pull that off? Now, he passes out almost immediately after doing this, which of course, indicates it's a huge strain on him. But again, this is the kind of continued expansion of the powers of Everett, right? The idea that like he can sync with people, and that in years past, he could only do it with people who were in his immediate vicinity. Once they were out of his vicinity, his ability to sync with them basically vanished until they returned. Eventually, we were given this idea that he could kind of tap into a quote unquote memory of them, but even then it was limited. What's going on here is that essentially Jerry Dugan and Marvel are telling us once Everett syncs with someone, he can seemingly do it forever, right? He can just always draw on their powers over and over again. Now, again, we don't really know the full totality of this, and in fact, we'll see this shift as time goes on, right? We'll see more about how his powers function and how they work as things progress. It just makes logical sense. But in the aftermath of all this, you do have an instance where Bornin goes after Cyclops, or really goes after a younger kid. Cyclops gets in the way, saves this kid, and then is attacked by Bornin. When that happens, he's severely injured, but it kind of leaves him out of the immediate purview of the other X-Men, which allows Dr. Stasis to show up, slice his throat, and then walk away. And that's why it is that Cyclops basically can't come back out again as Cyclops as we know him, because his death was exceedingly public. Everybody saw it happen. And remember, the X-Men are keeping the secret of resurrection something to themselves. They're not really allowing anybody else to know about it, and in fact, almost no one else does know about it, and those who do know are basically keeping it quiet at the request of the X-Men, hence the whole thing with Ben Urich and the expose he was going to write in learning that the X-Men had solved the equation of resurrection. So if Cyclops were to simply show back up again, people would know they can bring folks back from the dead, and everything changes, right? At that point, you're talking about politics be damned. It's a full-on human invasion of Krakoa to take the secrets of resurrection. Again, just kind of arguing self-preservation, right? The simplistic nature of humanity. And so with that being the case, Cyclops basically has to undergo the process, or at least adopt a new moniker, which ended up becoming Captain Krakoa. Of course, he uses technology in order to achieve that, but again, this is one of those things. People will kind of get pissy about it, but people get angry about this stuff because they don't know anything about comic books. Eventually, Cyclops is going to go back to being Cyclops. Or for those of you guys who are new, ignore the naysayers in the comments section who are like, it's a problem when things change. Cyclops is going to go back to being Cyclops, right? So ignore those guys. Don't worry about them. You know, they just don't know what they're talking about. They don't know anything about comics. So it's one of those interesting things where we kind of get to see what this is going to look like for a period of time in Marvel. And I'm curious to see where it ends up going. Now, at this point, we basically switch over to a boat where everybody's going crazy and killing each other. And the reason why is because we essentially have something called Project Amy, right? Which is short for Project Amygdala, which essentially the part of the brain that regulates the fight or flight response, that it's being manipulated, really using these people as an experiment, which is being recorded by what looks like advanced idea mechanics, which is pretty gruesome when you think about it. And basically it's the plot from 28 Days Later, where people are just going absolutely crazy with rage and just massacring each other. The entire project is being overseen by MODOK, because why not? Why wouldn't MODOK oversee something like this? Now, of course, the X-Men respond, and this is one of the things to know. The way that Jerry Dugan is doing this is it's a bunch of stories that seem disconnected that will connect once you get to the end of it, right? So it's kind of a differing nature by way Jerry Dugan tells a story, which is similar to Hickman, just not as organized. So the thing about this is that you basically have this kind of ongoing plot. While the X-Men are here and dealing with this segment is not overly important. What is difficult here is the struggle of Everett Thomas. It's the struggle of him in relation to Laura Kinney. Because one of the things to remember is that when they were in the vault, right, the Children of the Vault, during Jonathan Hickman's run, for those of you guys who recall that, when they were in the vault and all that time had passed for them, they had spent a lifetime together. And while Laura was basically resurrected and she doesn't really remember any of that, Everett does. And Everett recalls all those things that they went through. So for him, he lived a life with a woman that doesn't know who he is anymore. And as a result of that, there's a lot of pain and a lot of struggle that goes on there, because he wants on one hand to sort of rekindle that relationship, but on the other hand, Laura's like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So it's almost kind of him sort of trying to force himself on her to a degree, not physically, but the emotional attachment that he has for her. Now, of course, once they get in there, they basically end up, taking it to MODOK, basically just kind of wrecking this guy, essentially. And of course, Captain Krakoa uses the telepathic powers of Everett, who of course has those powers due to the fact that he's tapping into the abilities of Jean Grey, to effectively invade the mind of MODOK, right? And in doing so, MODOK had always kind of played this game, historically speaking, of he knows people's most personal weaknesses, he knows how to target them specifically, that kind of a thing. This moment here is only really significant if you know the history of MODOK, but the point, the bigger point here is that Cyclops knows the internal motivations of MODOK himself. And the idea here is, as long as you stay away, I'll stay away. But it's kind of cool because MODOK has a sort of family for himself that he fashions having and different things along those lines. He's nowhere near as violent as he historically seems to be, but Cyclops has basically found his weakness, right? In his heart of hearts, what it is that he desires most. And the response of Cyclops is, if you keep doing this, if you keep being this villainous guy who's engaging in these crazy activities and whatnot, then we'll use this against you, right? We'll literally break your mind and we'll break down who you are by using these things. Now, the other question that we had here was how it was that Ben Urich, who is going to publish the story on how it is that the X-Men have managed to solve resurrection, why he had forgotten about it, because we didn't know exactly what had happened. When Cyclops had called him up and said, hey, I'm a friend of Cyclops, and so on and so forth, and I know what's going on with the X-Men and resurrection, do you have time to talk? Ben Urich's response was, I don't know what you're talking about. So in effect, his mind had basically been wiped, or he had been killed and secretly resurrected, which I think would have been a cool alternative. But what had actually gone on here is that Everett had realized what it was that Ben Urich had tapped into. He'd realized what it was that Ben Urich was doing, in the sense that he was essentially going to write an article about resurrection, and it could have entirely jeopardized everything with Krakoa. So what Everett did is he wiped Ben's mind. Now this is a really, really huge moment here, because Everett has not really been a guy who would do stuff like this. Everett's one of those very few holdovers from the old Generation X stories where he was just intrinsically a good guy. He did a few morally questionable things, but nothing on this level. And that's why it's really sort of a strange, or really kind kind of a mind-boggling situation to see him do this, because what Everett realized when he basically showed up, wiped the mind of Ben Urich, and then took his notebook and all his information, is he realized Ben was not really going to write any kind of a hack job on the X-Men, right? He's not like a modern-day news organization where he's basically trying to write things from a negative slant. Instead, what he was looking to do was write things from like a more truthful slant, and in fact, one that would actually shine the X-Men in a more positive light. But he didn't realize what he had done, or at least what was going to happen as a result of what he'd done, until he took the notebook. So in effect, he had actually cost the X-Men positive publicity, but more so than that, he had approached the situation from an exceedingly negative standpoint when it wasn't going to be the case. And in fact, he really says like Ben Urich always thought that we were miracles, that he really wanted to write the X-Men, or at least write about the X-Men and Resurrection in a positive way. Now that's going to become very important later on, but it's one of those guilt moments that basically Everett has to deal with as a result of what he's done. Now the other part of this is MODOK in terms of his return as far as his involvement with Dr. Stasis. And the reason for this is that what ends up happening is that while MODOK's scheme was just MODOK being MODOK and just doing his thing, it drew the attention of the folks at Orchis. It drew the attention of Dr. Stasis and those guys. Now, we didn't initially know that Stasis was working with Orchis. We know that now, but it's one of those things where he's kind of their scientific arm to a degree. The overall gist here, and one of the things to know, is that Ben Urich's initial knowledge of the fact that humans had cracked the code of Resurrection had actually been given to him by Dr. Stasis. He's the one that sent him on that path in the first place. And that's kind of their first stage, right? That Orchis is a multi-pronged organization. They're simultaneously launching attacks against the X-Men on a physical front while also doing it from a more political front. And the idea here, at least on the political level, is to leak to a journalist the fact that the X-Men can resurrect the dead and then have that become public knowledge, in the hopes that humanity learning about that will lead to humanity attacking the entirety of the X-Men. Now, what humanity will need in that moment is effectively some kind of a leadership, right? Someone that can really kind of appear and say, hey, we're the ones that can help you achieve your goal of taking resurrection from those mutants who are being selfish and give it to the rest of society. And so Orchis seeks to position themselves in that role, and Dr. Stasis is the one that's basically spearheading the effort. The other part of this is to actually work in such a way to where they can not only launch an attack against the mutant population, but also launch an attack against humanity as well. That's the goal here with regards to what they want to do in terms of bringing MODOK in. In fact, taking his Project Amy, having MODOK basically spearhead the project and then use it to attack the whole of humanity. That in doing so, Orchis can, in one fell swoop, solidify control of not just Earth from the mutant population, but also from humanity itself, and position themselves as effectively demigods. And so what you get here is the different members of Orchis who are curious about it, but Nimrod is the most curious about it. And Nimrod's like, okay, I would like to meet this MODOK, right? I want to meet this killing machine. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong here, although I don't think I am, as far as I'm aware, I believe this is the first time in Marvel Comics that Nimrod meets MODOK. Now, this is where a lot of the theories are coming from regarding what the full intention of Orchis is with the mutant population outside of having Ben Urich publish some article about their resurrection. That if MODOK's technology or his ability to manipulate the amygdala and send people into a fit of rage can be weaponized by Orchis, then with Krakoa presenting a kind of unified front among the mutant population, the best way to bring them down is to force them to fight each other. And the best way to do that is to use Project Amy to essentially create a giant kind of civil war among the mutants that exist on Krakoa, which, I'll be honest, the Marvel Universe already had its civil war among all the superheroes. If you guys recall, the X-Men were hands off. They didn't want to have anything to do with that. They were like, nope, there's so few of us already, we're not going to risk lives, right? Because remember, Civil War took place during the events of Decimation when all you had was 198 mutants left. So this would be a phenomenal opportunity for Marvel to present us with an X-Men Civil War that would literally be their Civil War pertaining strictly to them. But Nimrod and Dr. Stasis and those guys end up breaking MODOK out of jail and then bring him into Orchis. And that's where things get really, really intriguing, because following that, one of the things that happens here is there comes a point when X-23 is basically resurrected, right? Not long ago on Krakoa at the Arbor Magna, which of course is where they resurrect people. One of the big questions a lot of you guys had is that when it comes to the resurrection process, how is it that someone like Wolverine is resurrected with adamantium on his body, right? Like if he's being resurrected, wouldn't he just show up with bone claws? The way that Jonathan Hickman geniusly answered that question was to use Proteus. Remember, Proteus can manipulate matter on the atomic level, but he can only do it in a localized space, right? In a small space, which is kind of how Marvel kept him in check, right? Creating a guy who could alter reality reality, but removing him from the possibility of being a guy who can alter reality on a universal level. What Proteus would do is, in the case of someone like Wolverine, Proteus would basically have adamantium bonded to his body, because one of the things that was established in the early days of Marvel Comics when it came to Proteus is his ability to manipulate matter included adamantium, and all he needs is a sample of it. And so one of the funny things here is they actually end up changing the powers of Laura Kinney, that when X-23 is resurrected, historically, she's only ever had adamantium claws. Her bones are just normal bones. When Proteus resurrects her, he thought that everybody who was basically based off Wolverine had adamantium bones. So when Laura Kinney's resurrected, she's given adamantium bones. She has a skeleton structure just like Wolverine does now, which is really cool. It's one of those small little modifications. It's just done kind of off the cuff, and you wouldn't really realize it unless you were paying very close attention, but it is a cool little thing because now she's got a whole new level of power. And so the other part of this is, in a lot of ways, Jerry Dugan just kind of rounding out and sort of bringing in characters that we hadn't really seen for a while. We were kind of wondering where they were, what was going on with them. In this instance, the X-Men pick up on a mutant signature that's essentially being held in an Orcus base. And so they send Laura Kinney in to basically retrieve that person, right? Because Wolverine's doing his own thing and Laura Kinney's part of the official X-Men team, so it makes perfect sense they would send her in. When she gets in there and she locates where this mutant is, she ends up cracking open the device that holds this mutant, and then she's like immediately attacked, only for us to find out it's Lady Deathstrike. Now, for people who are not really familiar with her character, it's kind of like, who? But Yuriko is a great character who just doesn't really get utilized properly, right? She just doesn't really get used in the right way. Now, one of the funny things is, for those of you guys who ever saw X-Men the Animated Series and you saw the Reavers, their introduction came by way of Lady Deathstrike basically receiving her modifications that were done by them. In the comics, they were all modified at the same time, right? They were actually on an island when it all happened, and it was a kind of a cool story, I guess. Fact remains, she's been around for quite some time. She's an exceedingly dangerous person, and in fact, she's able to go toe-to-toe with Laura Kinney to a degree until Laura basically cuts off her arm. And then that's when you end up finding out that Deathstrike attacked her because she thought that Laura was working for Dr. Stasis. That's kind of how all this is unfolding. That Lady Deathstrike has basically been manipulated and used by Dr. Stasis for his own ends. She's of course brought back to Krakoa. She undergoes the resurrection process and then of course ends up just kind of returning as she normally does, you know, with her body intact and so on and so forth, and then ultimately ends up leaving. There are some adjustments that are made to her, right? We don't know the full extent of those adjustments, but for example, her hands are not gigantic adamantium claws anymore. So we don't know exactly what direction her powers are going to go in, how she's going to unfold. It's one of those things where Jerry Dugan does this to set the stage for her, but this is one of those instances where I talk about how Jerry Dugan just tries to cram too much stuff into a singular story, right? He tries to put too many things in there at one time. And so switching back over to Cyclops and over to, well, really with Synch, because Synch is kind of a Swiss Army knife of powers, he's really an Omega level mutant at this point. He has not been officially confirmed, but at the moment, the X-Men are considering that, right? The Quiet Council is like, should we list this guy as an Omega level mutant? And if he is, how do we categorize him, right? Where do we put him? Like, how do we keep him as part of the main X-Men team? Can we find a better role for him? Different things like that. But I would surmise once his powers reach their peak, he's going to be a one-man army, right? He's like the guy you send in for basically anything, and he can copy the powers of anybody. So we don't know the full extent of that, right? We don't know how far-reaching that is. This is one of those instances where his powers could become limitless. But with him and Cyclops basically trying to track down Dr. Stasis and figure out what's going on with this guy, they ultimately discover his lair. Of course, they're attacked by Bornin, and of course that guy's dealt with pretty quickly. But one of the cool things that happens here is Everett actually syncs with Laura, even though she's not there, and pops adamantium claws. And in doing so, basically attacks Bornin and then kills him, right? Cuts him in half. This is one of those moments, right? This guy's just ridiculously overpowered. He's going to become just some insane character. And so Cyclops and Synch end up tracking down Stasis. They locate him in his lair. A kind of fight breaks out, and that's when we get the revelation of who Stasis really is. Like, Cyclops literally blows the mask off his face, and that's when we end up finding out that basically Dr. Stasis is Nathaniel Essex. He's Mr. Sinister. But here's the caveat to this. Here's where this gets really, really, really cool. So what goes on here is Essex, right, Sinister, doesn't know who Cyclops is. And he's like, do I know you? right? Like, I have no idea who you are. And that what happens is that as they start fighting with each other, that Cyclops, keeps referring to him as like some clone that went awry. But what Essex does here is he says, no, I'm the real Essex. Like, I'm the actual Nathaniel Essex. I don't know who you are, but I'm the actual Nathaniel Essex. Now, this is a monumental thing that's going on here. And the reason why is because in Marvel Comics, the relationship between Nathaniel Essex and Cyclops is an exceedingly old relationship, right? Like literally, Nathaniel Essex's whole story throughout like the entirety of the 80s, right? His introduction from Marvel Comics throughout the 70s, the 80s, running all the way up to the modern era, is that Essex had realized that if Jean Grey and Cyclops ever had a child, their child would be godly powerful. It would be absurdly powerful. It's always been the cornerstone of his obsession with Cyclops and Jean. And so he's always trying to find a way to initiate a coupling or to use their genetic material to basically create a clone, different things along those lines, right? In the Age of Apocalypse, he successfully did that. Nate Gray, X-Man from the Age of Apocalypse storyline, he's the answer to the question, what if Jean Grey and Cyclops had a kid and that kid had untapped power? What this basically means here is that if this really is the real Nathaniel Essex, then it means the Nathaniel Essex that we know of, the one who's obsessed with Jean Grey and Scott Summers, it's always been a clone. That it's never been the actual Nathaniel Essex. Hence the reason why they look different, right? The Nathaniel Essex that we know, that we're the most familiar with, has a diamond-shaped object on his head. That Nathaniel Essex here has like a clover leaf on his head, right? Has like a clover sitting there. So it explains why they look different. Now, there is a kind of argument that's created here by Essex that like that version of him, right, that's on like the Quiet Council, the one that we've always known, is just some twisted, screwed up version. But this argument or this kind of presentation that this is the actual Essex, it does make sense. If you go back and you look at the old stuff, say for example, like the events that led up to Weapons Plus, right? The things that led up to like Wolverine and stuff like that, right? Post World War II, or at least during World War II, when Nathaniel Essex was working in the concentration camps and he was experimenting on mutants who had been captured by the Germans, even though the Germans didn't really know what they were, trying to understand the mutant genome and so on and so forth, trying to crack the code, that there wasn't really a whole lot of explanation as to how it was we went from that Essex to the one that we most commonly see now. It was just kind of like he was obsessed with the human genome and like that was it, right? So it makes perfect sense that like this is the actual real Nathaniel Essex and the other one is just kind of a clone that basically went rogue and did his own thing. We don't know. And in fact, we still don't have an answer to that. We'll likely get one, but the reality here is that this Essex, while he doesn't really see himself as a mutant or doesn't really present himself as a mutant, and in fact, he's staunchly anti-mutant. Now, the truth here is that if this really is the original Essex, he was created by Apocalypse, right? His body was modified by Apocalypse, but he's not an actual mutant. He's basically just a guy that had his genes modified by Apocalypse to give him powers. So it would make sense that he is staunchly anti-mutant because at his core, he's human. There's no X gene in Nathaniel Essex, and there never was. And so ultimately, once Cyclops and those guys basically bail because Essex ends up detonating all these bombs in his facility, and then of course it puts a bunch of innocent lives in jeopardy on the surface, the Cyclops and them take off, and that Essex basically disappears, right? He ends up, kind of going away and then traveling back to the Orcus base where he meets with everybody. And they're just kind of like, he's kind of like, yep, we just had another run in with the X-Men and it was a bit of a failure, but in the end, we'll still recoup, right? We'll still get it back together and we'll still target the X-Men properly. As far as Ben Urich goes, because of the guilt that Everett feels, that what they end up doing is revealing what it was that had been done to Ben Urich, that his mind had been wiped, all the information is returned to him, and Ben Urich is allowed to write his story. The undercurrent here, and what's so interesting about this, is that it really is the X-Men playing politics, because no way they would have allowed this to happen if the story was going to be a hatchet job on the X-Men. If it was going to be Ben Urich literally like dumping on the X-Men and just being like, these selfish bastards have the cure for death and they won't share it for anybody, or they won't share it with anybody else out there. No way the X-Men would have let that been published, right? So it's just one of those things where it's like everybody has an agenda, whether they want to admit it or not. So it's a really, really cool situation here. This is Jerry Dugan just cramming a ton of stuff. By the way, this is us leaving out everything that has to do with Game World, right? So yeah, Jerry Dugan he crams too much stuff into a singular story. I don't know why he does that. I have no idea why that's the case, but he just does too much. He treats every single story arc like it's the only story arc he has to write a story. And it just makes things overly complicated and just way too difficult. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.